The desert heat shimmered like liquid glass across the rocky terrain as Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez adjusted his tactical vest and checked his watch. It was 0630 hours, and the sun was already painting the Afghan landscape in harsh shades of gold and brown. Behind him, 847 Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marine Regiment prepared for what intelligence had promised would be a routine sweep and clear operation in the Helmand province. Rodriguez had been in Afghanistan for 8 months now, and he knew better than to trust the word routine when it came to Taliban territory. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Advance through the valley, check 3 abandoned compounds for insurgent activity, and return to base before the afternoon heat became unbearable. What the intelligence reports hadn't mentioned was the network of hidden bunkers and tunnels that the enemy had spent months preparing. Captain Sarah Chen, the company commander, gathered her squad leaders around a dusty map spread across the hood of their lead Humvee. Her voice carried the confidence that had earned her the respect of every Marine under her command. But Rodriguez noticed the slight tension in her jaw that appeared whenever she sensed something wasn't quite right. "Listen up," Chen began, pointing to a narrow passage between 2 ridges. "We'll move through this valley in 3 columns. 1st platoon takes the left flank, 2nd platoon down the center, 3rd platoon on the right. We maintain visual contact at all times and advance slowly. This area has been quiet for 2 weeks. But that doesn't mean we get careless." Private First Class Tommy Williams, barely 19 and on his first deployment, shifted nervously as he checked his M4 carbine for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The other Marines had taken him under their wing during training, but combat was different. Everything felt more real, more permanent. The weight of his gear seemed heavier, and every shadow looked like it might hide an enemy fighter. Corporal Lisa Martinez, one of the few female Marines in the infantry unit, noticed Williams' nervous energy and gave him a reassuring nod. She had been through this before and understood the mixture of anticipation and fear that came with heading into potentially hostile territory. Martinez had proven herself in 2 previous firefights and had earned the nickname Steel Eyes for her ability to stay calm under pressure. As the convoy began to move, the Marines spread out in their assigned formations. The landscape around them was deceptively peaceful, with scattered rocks and dried vegetation providing the only variation in the monotonous terrain. Small dust devils danced in the distance, and the only sounds were the rumble of diesel engines and the crunch of boots on gravel. Rodriguez kept his eyes moving constantly, scanning for anything that seemed out of place. His experience had taught him to look for the things that didn't belong: a rock that seemed too perfectly positioned, ground that looked recently disturbed, or the absence of normal sounds. In Afghanistan, survival often depended on noticing what wasn't there as much as what was. The first indication that something was wrong came from Sergeant Johnson, who was walking point for the center column. He raised his fist, signaling for the entire formation to halt. Through his radio headset, Rodriguez heard Johnson's voice, tense but controlled. "Movement on the ridgeline. Approximately 400 meters northeast. Can't get a clear visual." Unquote. Captain Chen immediately moved to Johnson's position, pulling out her binoculars. She studied the area carefully, searching for any sign of hostile activity. The ridgeline appeared empty, but Chen had learned to trust her Marine's instincts. If Johnson thought he saw movement, there was probably something worth investigating. "All units, maintain positions," Chen ordered over the radio. "Weapons team, set up overwatch on that ridgeline. Nobody moves until we know what we're dealing with." The Marines quickly adjusted their positions, creating overlapping fields of fire while staying as low as possible. The machine gun team, led by Corporal Davis, found a suitable position behind a large boulder and began setting up their M240B. The familiar routine of preparing for potential combat helped steady everyone's nerves. Minutes passed in tense silence. The sun climbed higher, and the heat began to build. Sweat started to form under helmets and body armor, but nobody moved unnecessarily. In this kind of situation, patience could mean the difference between life and death. Then the world exploded. The first rocket-propelled grenade struck near the lead vehicle, sending a shower of rock and metal fragments across the formation. Before the Marines could fully react, Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions along both ridgelines. The enemy had waited until the Americans were perfectly positioned in the valley's kill zone before opening fire. Contact. Contact. We're taking fire from multiple positions. Chen's voice cut through the chaos as bullets whined overhead and ricocheted off rocks. All units, find cover and return fire. Rodriguez dove behind a low stone wall that provided minimal protection from the incoming fire. Around him, Marines were scrambling for whatever cover they could find in the relatively open terrain. The enemy had chosen their ambush site well, positioning themselves on high ground where they could pour fire down into the valley. Private Williams found himself pressed against a boulder next to Corporal Martinez, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the gunfire. Martinez grabbed his shoulder and shouted over the noise. "Keep your head down and your rifle up. Aim for muzzle flashes on the ridgeline." The machine gun team was trying to establish suppressive fire, but they were taking heavy incoming fire from at least 3 different positions. Corporal Davis called out coordinates to his gunner, while bullets sparked off the rocks around them. The distinctive crack of AK-47 seconds mixed with the deeper sound of heavier machine guns, indicating that the enemy force was larger and better equipped than intelligence had suggested. Captain Chen was on her radio, calling for immediate support. "Falcon Base, this is Viper 6. We are in contact with a large enemy force. Request immediate air support and medevac standby. We have Marines pinned down in Grid Square November Delta 4789. The response crackled through the static. "Viper 6. Falcon Base. Understood. Be advised. Nearest air support is 20 minutes out. Can you maintain your position?" Chen looked around at her Marines, who were spread across the valley floor, using whatever cover they could find to return fire at an enemy they could barely see. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours when bullets were flying overhead. "Affirmative, Falcon Base. We'll hold our position," Chen replied, though she wasn't entirely sure how they were going to accomplish that feat. Sergeant Rodriguez had managed to work his way to a position where he could see some of the enemy muzzle flashes on the eastern ridge. He carefully aimed his rifle and began engaging targets, calling out positions to the other Marines in his sector. The training that had been drilled into them countless times was taking over, helping them function despite the chaos. The firefight intensified as more enemy positions revealed themselves. It became clear that the Taliban fighters had been planning this ambush for some time, positioning themselves in concealed bunkers and spider holes that provided excellent protection, while allowing them to maintain devastating fields of fire. Williams fired his rifle at shadows and muzzle flashes, trying to control his breathing like he had been taught in training. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled his nostrils, and the constant noise was overwhelming. He had never imagined that combat would be so loud, so confusing, so absolutely terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Corporal Martinez was proving why she had earned her nickname, methodically engaging targets while helping coordinate the return fire from her section. She spotted an enemy machine gun position that was causing significant problems for the Marines on the left flank and called in coordinates to the mortar team. Mortars, steel eyes. Enemy machine gun. Grid November Delta 4785. Elevation, 200 meters. Request immediate suppression. The 60mm mortars began dropping rounds on the enemy position, but the Taliban fighters were well dug in and continued their assault. It was becoming clear that the Marines were facing a much larger and better prepared force than anyone had anticipated. As the minutes dragged on, ammunition began to run low, and several Marines had been wounded by shrapnel and grazing shots. The enemy fire was too accurate and too intense for anyone to move to better positions or to retrieve the wounded. They were effectively pinned down in the kill zone, exactly where the enemy wanted them. Captain Chen realized that without immediate and overwhelming air support, her Marines were in serious danger of being overrun. The enemy was beginning to move to flanking positions, and if they succeeded in getting around the Marine formation, the situation would become critical very quickly. She got back on her radio. "Falcon Base, Viper 6. We need that air support now. Enemy forces are attempting to flank our position. We have wounded and are running low on ammunition." The radio crackled with static before the response came. "Viper 6, be advised. Apache bird is inbound to your location. Call sign, Ghost Rider. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes still seemed like an eternity as the enemy fire continued to intensify. The Taliban fighters had revealed more positions and were concentrating their fire on the areas where the Marines had found cover. Rocks were being chipped away by bullet impacts, and the smell of cordite hung heavy in the hot air. Rodriguez noticed that the enemy fire was becoming more coordinated, indicating that they had experienced leadership directing the attack. This wasn't just a group of insurgents who had stumbled across the Marine patrol. This was a well-planned and expertly executed ambush designed to inflict maximum casualties. The wounded Marines were being treated by their fellow soldiers using whatever medical supplies they had available. But proper medical evacuation was impossible under the current conditions. Doc Peterson, the unit's corpsman, was crawling from position to position, treating wounds while enemy bullets snapped overhead. As the firefight continued, it became increasingly clear that the 847 Marines were facing a desperate situation. They were outnumbered, pinned down in open terrain, and taking casualties. Their only hope lay in the Apache helicopter that was racing toward their position, carrying a pilot who would soon prove that courage and skill could overcome overwhelming odds. The sun continued its relentless climb toward its noon position, and the desert heat was beginning to take its toll on the Marines. Combined with the stress of combat and the weight of their gear, several soldiers were beginning to show signs of heat exhaustion. But they held their positions and continued to fight, knowing that their survival depended on maintaining their defensive formation until help arrived. Captain Chen checked her watch and realized that only 5 minutes had passed since the air support had been promised. Time moved differently in combat, and every second felt like an hour when lives were hanging in the balance. She looked around at her Marines, dirty, sweating, and scared, but still fighting with the determination that had made them legends in every conflict America had ever fought. The enemy fire showed no signs of letting up, and Chen knew that they couldn't hold their current positions much longer. The Apache helicopter approaching their location represented their only chance for survival, but 15 minutes still stretched ahead like an impossible distance to cover. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of gunfire, the faint thrum of rotor blades began to echo across the valley. Chief Warrant Officer 3, Elena Vasquez, felt the familiar vibration of the AH-64D Apache longbow as she pushed the aircraft to its maximum speed across the Afghan landscape. In the front seat, her co-pilot and gunner, Chief Warrant Officer 2, Marcus Thompson, was already analyzing the target area through his advanced targeting system. The urgency in the radio transmissions from the pinned-down Marines had left no doubt about the severity of the situation they were flying into. Vasquez had accumulated over 1,200 flight hours in the Apache, with 400 of those in combat operations. She had earned the call sign Reaper, not for any dark fascination with death, but for her ability to methodically eliminate enemy threats with surgical precision. At 32 years old, she was one of the most experienced Apache pilots in her squadron, and had never lost a ground unit that had called for her support. Ghost Rider, this is Viper 6. Captain Chen's voice crackled through their headsets. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions on both ridgelines. We have wounded and are running critically low on ammunition. Need immediate suppression of enemy positions. Thompson was already identifying targets through his target acquisition and designation system. The thermal imaging revealed at least 12 enemy positions scattered across the ridgelines. With more likely hidden from view, the Taliban fighters had created an impressive defensive network, with overlapping fields of fire and well-concealed fighting positions. Viper 6, Ghost Rider, Vasquez responded, her voice calm despite the critical situation. We have visual on your position and are identifying enemy targets. Recommend your people stay low and mark your positions with smoke if you have it available. Below them, the valley looked like a scene from hell. Muzzle flashes dotted both ridgelines like deadly fireflies, and dust clouds marked where mortar rounds were impacting near the Marine positions. Vasquez could see the Marines spread across the valley floor, using whatever cover they could find while returning fire at an enemy that held every tactical advantage. Marcus, I'm seeing at least 4 machine gun positions on the eastern ridge, Vasquez said to her gunner. That heavy gun at grid November Delta 4791 is tearing those Marines apart. We take that one first. Thompson adjusted his targeting system and locked onto the position. The 30mm M230 chain gun was already loaded and ready. Target acquired. I have a clear shot. Take it. The Apache's nose dipped slightly as Thompson engaged the target. The 30mm cannon fired in controlled bursts, sending high-explosive rounds into the enemy machine gun position. The effect was immediate and devastating. The enemy gun fell silent as the position was obliterated in a cloud of smoke and debris. Good hit, Vasquez confirmed, already maneuvering to engage the next target. Let's work that ridgeline systematically. I want those Marines to have room to breathe. But the enemy wasn't going to make it easy. As soon as the Apache revealed its position by firing, the Taliban fighters turned some of their weapons skyward. Green tracer rounds began streaking past the helicopter as enemy fighters tried to bring down the aircraft with small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades. Taking fire from multiple positions, Thompson reported, his voice steady despite the bullets flying around them. RPG launch from the western ridge. Vasquez immediately threw the Apache into an evasive maneuver, dropping altitude while turning hard to the right. The rocket-propelled grenade passed close enough that they could see the warhead spinning as it flew past their rotor disc. She had dealt with RPG attacks before and knew that the key was to keep moving and never give the enemy a stable target. Viper 6, Ghost Rider. We're taking significant anti-aircraft fire. Are you able to provide suppressive fire on the western ridge to help us maneuver? Down in the valley, Captain Chen was coordinating the response. Despite their dire situation, the arrival of the Apache had given the Marines renewed hope and energy. All units, focus fire on the western ridge. Help our birds stay in the air. The Marines began concentrating their remaining ammunition on the enemy positions that were engaging the helicopter. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez spotted an enemy fighter with an RPG launcher and carefully aimed his rifle. The shot was difficult at that range, but he had been practicing long-distance shooting since his first deployment. His bullet found its target, and the enemy fighter dropped behind cover. Vasquez brought the Apache around for another attack run, this time targeting a cluster of enemy positions on the western ridge. She could see Taliban fighters moving between concealed bunkers, trying to coordinate their defense against both the helicopter and the ground forces. I'm going to use the Hellfires on that bunker complex, she told Thompson. It looks like their command position. The AGM-114 Hellfire missiles were laser-guided precision weapons, each carrying an 18-pound warhead capable of destroying fortified positions. Thompson designated the largest bunker with his laser, and Vasquez fired 2 missiles in rapid succession. The Hellfires struck within seconds of each other, creating massive explosions that shook the ground and sent debris flying hundreds of meters in all directions. When the smoke cleared, the entire enemy strongpoint had been eliminated, along with what appeared to be several fighters who had been using it as a rallying point. Outstanding, came the voice of Corporal Martinez over the radio. Ghost Rider, that was their command bunker. Enemy fire is becoming less coordinated, but the Taliban fighters were far from finished. As the Apache continued its attack runs, more enemy positions revealed themselves. It became clear that the insurgents had been preparing this ambush site for weeks, possibly months, creating an extensive network of fighting positions that could absorb significant punishment while continuing to fight. Vasquez found herself in a deadly aerial dance, constantly maneuvering to avoid enemy fire, while positioning the Apache for effective attacks on the Taliban positions. The helicopter's advanced systems gave her a significant advantage, but she was still flying a large, noisy aircraft over terrain that favored the defenders. Elena, we've got movement in that wadi to the south, Thompson warned. Looks like they're trying to flank the Marines from that direction. Vasquez immediately turned her attention to the new threat. Through her targeting system, she could see a group of enemy fighters moving through a dried riverbed, apparently attempting to get behind the Marine formation. If they succeeded, the Marines would be caught in a crossfire from 3 directions. Not on my watch, she muttered, maneuvering the Apache to intercept the flanking force. The 2.75-inch Hydra rockets were perfect for this kind of target. Each rocket carried a 17-pound warhead, and the Apache could fire them in salvos that would saturate an entire area. Vasquez lined up on the wadi and fired 6 rockets in rapid succession. The rockets streaked downward like angry hornets, detonating in a line across the enemy movement. The explosions sent up clouds of dust and smoke, and when it cleared, the flanking attempt had been stopped cold. Several enemy fighters were visible, retreating back toward their main positions. Flanking force neutralized, Thompson reported. But we're getting low on ammunition. We've expended most of our Hellfires and about half our rockets. Vasquez knew that ammunition management was critical in a prolonged engagement like this one. She still had plenty of 30mm cannon rounds, but the bigger weapons were what really made the difference against fortified positions. Viper 6, Ghost Rider. We're continuing to engage enemy positions, but our heavy ordnance is running low. What's your ammunition status? Captain Chen's response was not encouraging. Ghost Rider. We're down to about 30% ammunition across all positions. We need to end this fight soon, or we're going to be in serious trouble. The situation was becoming critical. While the Apache had eliminated several key enemy positions and disrupted their attack, there were still enough Taliban fighters remaining to pose a serious threat to the Marines, and with both the helicopter and the ground forces running low on ammunition, time was working against them. Vasquez made a decision that would have been considered extremely risky under normal circumstances. Instead of maintaining a safe standoff distance, she brought the Apache down low and began making close-in attacks on the remaining enemy positions. This made her helicopter an easier target, but it also made her weapons systems devastatingly effective. Flying barely 200 feet above the ridgeline, Thompson began engaging enemy positions with the 30mm cannon at point-blank range. The high explosive rounds were having a tremendous psychological effect on the enemy fighters, who had never experienced such aggressive close air support. "They're breaking," Rodriguez called out from his position. "I can see them abandoning positions on the eastern ridge." Indeed, the combination of accurate Apache fire and the relentless pressure from the Marines had finally begun to tell. Enemy fighters were pulling back from their forward positions, and the volume of incoming fire was decreasing noticeably. But the Taliban weren't finished yet. As Vasquez brought the Apache around for another low-level attack run, an enemy fighter who had remained hidden until that moment fired an RPG from a concealed position less than 300 meters away. "RPG, incoming," Thompson shouted. Vasquez yanked the Apache into a violent evasive maneuver, but the rocket was too close. The warhead detonated just below the helicopter's tail boom, sending shrapnel through the aircraft's structure and causing multiple warning lights to illuminate on her instrument panel. "We're hit," she reported, fighting to maintain control as the damaged helicopter shuddered and vibrated. Checking systems. The Apache had taken significant damage, but it was still flyable. However, Vasquez knew that they couldn't sustain much more punishment. She needed to end this fight quickly, before either her aircraft became unflyable or the Marines on the ground were overrun. "Marcus, do we have any Hellfires left?" "2 remaining," Thompson replied, his voice tight with concentration as he worked to keep his targeting systems operational despite the battle damage. Vasquez studied the remaining enemy positions and identified what appeared to be their last stronghold, a heavily fortified bunker complex on the northern ridge that was still pouring fire down on the Marines. "We're going to use both missiles on that bunker complex," she decided. "It's now or never." She lined up the damaged Apache for one final attack run, ignoring the continued enemy fire that was striking around them. Thompson locked onto the target with his laser designator, and Vasquez fired both remaining Hellfire missiles. The missiles tracked true to their target, striking the bunker complex with devastating effect. The explosions triggered secondary detonations as ammunition and weapons stored in the bunkers cooked off. The entire northern ridge seemed to erupt in flames and smoke. When the smoke began to clear, an eerie quiet settled over the valley. The massive explosions had eliminated the last organized enemy resistance, and the surviving Taliban fighters were in full retreat across the desert. "Cease fire, cease fire," Captain Chen called out to her Marines. "Check your sectors, but hold your fire unless you have a clear target." The battle was over, but Vasquez still had to get her damaged helicopter back to base. The Apache was shuddering badly, and several systems were showing red warning lights, but they had accomplished their mission. 847 Marines were alive, and the enemy force had been shattered. Viper 6. Ghost Rider. Enemy resistance appears to be neutralized. We're RTB for maintenance. You should be able to move your wounded now. Copy, Ghost Rider. Outstanding work. You just saved 847 Marines today. As Vasquez carefully nursed the damaged Apache back toward their base, she reflected on the engagement. It had been one of the most intense firefights of her career, and certainly the largest ground force she had ever supported. But that was what she had trained for, what she had dedicated her life to doing. The Marines below were already moving to treat their wounded and consolidate their position. The valley that had been a killing field just minutes before was now secure, thanks to the arrival of one Apache helicopter and a pilot who refused to let 847 Marines die on her watch. The silence that followed the final explosions was almost as overwhelming as the gunfire had been. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez slowly raised his head above the rocky outcrop that had been his shelter for the past hour and surveyed the battlefield. Smoke drifted across the ridgelines where the Apache's missiles had found their targets, and the acrid smell of explosives hung heavy in the still desert air. All squad leaders, report status. Captain Chen's voice came over the radio, steady despite the ordeal they had all just survived. One by one, the reports came in. Sergeant Martinez reported 3 wounded in her section, none life-threatening. Corporal Davis confirmed that his machine gun team was intact, but low on ammunition. Across the valley, similar reports painted a picture of a unit that had been bloodied, but not broken. Private Williams found that his hands were shaking as he tried to reload his rifle magazine. The reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. He had been in his first real firefight, pinned down by an enemy that had wanted to kill him, and had survived thanks to the courage of his fellow Marines and the skill of an Apache pilot he had never met. Doc Peterson was already moving between the wounded Marines, his medical bag in hand and his training taking over. The most seriously injured was Lance Corporal Stevens, who had taken shrapnel from a mortar round in his left shoulder and arm. Peterson worked quickly to stabilize the wound and prepare Stevens for evacuation. Stevens is going to need a medevac, Peterson reported to Captain Chen. The shrapnel missed the major arteries, but he's lost blood and needs surgery to remove the fragments. Chen nodded and got on her radio to coordinate the medical evacuation. With the immediate threat neutralized, helicopters could now safely land in the valley to retrieve the wounded. But first, she needed to ensure that the area was truly secure. First platoon, advance and clear those bunkers on the eastern ridge, Chen ordered. I want to make sure there are no enemy fighters left who might threaten the medevac birds. The Marines moved out cautiously, their weapons ready as they approached the positions that had been raining death on them just minutes before. What they found was a testament to the devastating effectiveness of modern air support. The enemy bunkers had been reduced to rubble, and scattered equipment and weapons indicated that the Taliban fighters had abandoned their positions in haste. Rodriguez led his squad up the eastern slope, stepping carefully around the debris from the Apache's attacks. In one of the destroyed bunkers, he found evidence of how well prepared the ambush had been. Maps of the valley were scattered among the rubble, marked with precise firing positions and fields of fire. This hadn't been a chance encounter. The enemy had been planning this attack for weeks. Captain, Rodriguez called over his radio, you need to see this. These guys had detailed maps of our route and timing. Someone gave them intelligence on our mission. The implications were sobering. Somewhere in the intelligence chain, there had been a leak that had nearly cost the lives of 847 Marines. Chen made a mental note to report this finding to higher headquarters for investigation. Meanwhile, 20 miles away at Forward Operating Base Lightning, Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vasquez was fighting a different kind of battle. The damaged Apache had made it back to base, but just barely. Warning lights covered her instrument panel, and the helicopter was making sounds that no pilot ever wanted to hear. Tower, Ghost Rider requesting immediate emergency landing, she transmitted as she approached the base. Aircraft has sustained combat damage and multiple system failures. The control tower cleared all other traffic and rolled out the emergency vehicles as Vasquez brought the Apache in for landing. The helicopter touched down hard, its damaged rotor system making the aircraft unstable, but they were safely on the ground. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson climbed out of his front seat and immediately began examining the damage to their aircraft. What he saw made him realize how close they had come to not making it home. Shrapnel had punctured the fuel tank, damaged hydraulic lines, and come within inches of severing critical flight controls. "Elena, come look at this," Thompson called out. "We shouldn't have been able to fly with this much damage." Vasquez joined him in examining the battle damage. The Apache looked like it had flown through a metal storm, which wasn't far from the truth. Multiple holes punctured the fuselage, and scorch marks showed where fragments had passed dangerously close to vital systems. "We were lucky," she admitted, running her hand along a piece of shrapnel that had embedded itself just inches from the main rotor control system. A few inches in any direction, and those Marines would still be pinned down in that valley. The base maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Williams, arrived to assess the damage. He had been working on helicopters for 20 years and had seen plenty of battle damage, but the condition of Ghost Rider impressed even him. "Ma'am, I don't know how you got this bird back to base," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "This aircraft should be unflyable. The fact that you kept it in the air long enough to complete your mission is nothing short of miraculous." Word of the successful rescue mission was already spreading throughout the base. The operations center had been monitoring the radio traffic throughout the engagement, and everyone knew that 847 Marines had been saved from a potentially disastrous situation. Colonel James Patterson, the base commander, arrived at the flight line to personally thank Vasquez and Thompson for their actions. Patterson was a veteran of 3 combat deployments and understood the significance of what the Apache crew had accomplished. "Chief Vasquez, what you and Thompson did today exemplifies the very best of military aviation," Patterson said. "Those Marines are alive because you were willing to put yourselves at risk to save them. I'm recommending both of you for the Distinguished Flying Cross." Vasquez was uncomfortable with the praise. In her mind, she had simply done her job, the job she had trained for and dedicated her life to performing. "Sir, any pilot in the squadron would have done the same thing. Those Marines needed help, and we were in position to provide it." But Patterson knew better. Not every pilot would have been willing to make the low-level attacks that Vasquez had used to break the enemy's defensive positions. Her willingness to accept risk in order to save the Marines had been the difference between success and catastrophe. Back in the valley, the medical evacuation helicopter was landing in a cloud of dust. The UH-60 Black Hawk that served as the medevac bird was a welcome sight to the Marines, who had been carrying their wounded comrades for what seemed like hours. Doc Peterson supervised the loading of Lance Corporal Stevens and 2 other wounded Marines onto the helicopter. The crew chief, a veteran medic named Sergeant Rodriguez, took over their care as soon as they were aboard the aircraft. "They're going to be fine," Rodriguez assured Peterson as the Black Hawk prepared to depart. "Stevens will be back with you in a couple of months. Good as new." Captain Chen watched the medevac helicopter disappear over the ridge, carrying her wounded Marines to the surgical facilities at the main base. She felt a mixture of relief and pride as she looked at the men and women under her command. They had faced a determined enemy in a carefully planned ambush and had fought their way out through courage, teamwork, and the support of an exceptional Apache pilot. "All right, Marines," Chen called out to her troops. "Let's police up this battlefield and get ready to move. We've got a long walk back to base, and I want to be there before dark." The Marines began the methodical process of collecting equipment, securing the area, and preparing for the march back to their base. The adrenaline from the firefight was beginning to wear off, replaced by the bone-deep fatigue that follows intense combat. Private Williams found himself walking next to Corporal Martinez as they began the trek home. The experience had changed him, and he knew it. He had been tested in combat and had not been found wanting. More importantly, he had learned that the Marine Corps was truly a brotherhood, where everyone looked out for everyone else. "How do you feel?" Martinez asked, noticing the thoughtful expression on the young Marine's face. "Different," Williams replied honestly. "I mean, I'm glad we made it through, but it's hard to believe how close we came to not making it out at all. That Apache pilot saved our lives." Martinez nodded in agreement. She had been in firefights before, but none as intense or as prolonged as this one. The arrival of Ghost Rider had turned the tide at exactly the right moment, preventing what could have been a massacre. As the Marines walked through the desert heat, each of them was dealing with their own thoughts about what had happened. Combat had a way of clarifying what was truly important in life, and many of them found themselves thinking about families back home and the letters they would write that evening. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was thinking about the intelligence failure that had nearly cost them everything. Someone would have to answer for the leak that had allowed the enemy to prepare such an elaborate ambush, but that was a problem for the officers and investigators to solve. His job was to get his Marines home safely, and thanks to the Apache pilot, he had been able to do that. 3 days later, at Forward Operating Base Lightning, a ceremony was held to recognize the actions of Chief Warrant Officer Vasquez and Chief Warrant Officer Thompson. The entire squadron was present, along with representatives from the Marine unit they had saved. Captain Chen had flown in specifically to thank the Apache crew in person. She stood before the assembled crowd and described the desperate situation her Marines had faced and the courage that Vasquez had shown in breaking the enemy's hold on their position. Chief Vasquez didn't just provide close air support that day, Chen told the audience. She put her own life at risk to save 847 Marines who were pinned down and running out of options. Her willingness to make repeated low-level attacks against heavily defended positions turned the tide of the battle and allowed all of my Marines to go home to their families. Vasquez stood at attention as Colonel Patterson pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to her uniform. The medal was one of the highest awards for heroism in aerial combat, and it was richly deserved. But she knew that the real reward was standing in the audience. 847 Marines who were alive because she had been willing to do her job under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. Thompson also received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role in the engagement. His accurate gunnery and target identification had been crucial to the success of the mission, and his calm professionalism under fire had allowed them to work as an effective team throughout the battle. After the ceremony, Vasquez found herself surrounded by Marines from Captain Chen's unit, who had come to thank her personally. Many of them were young, barely out of their teens, and she was struck by how much they had matured during their deployment to Afghanistan. Private Williams, now promoted to Lance Corporal, shook her hand and looked her directly in the eyes. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I'm going home to my family because of what you did that day. I'll never forget that." Similar conversations took place throughout the afternoon, as Marines who had been in the valley that day expressed their gratitude to the pilot who had saved their lives. For Vasquez, these personal interactions meant more than any medal or official recognition. That evening, as she sat in her quarters writing a letter to her own family, Vasquez reflected on the events of the past few days. She had joined the army to serve her country and to be part of something larger than herself. The engagement in the valley had proven that her training, her dedication, and her willingness to take risks could make a real difference in the lives of fellow service members. She thought about the young Marines she had met after the ceremony, many of whom reminded her of her younger brother back home in Texas. They had families who were waiting for them to return safely, and she had been able to play a role in making sure that happened. The Distinguished Flying Cross sat on her desk, catching the light from her reading lamp. It was a symbol of recognition for her actions. But the real meaning of what she had done was walking around the base, getting ready for more missions, and preparing to go home to their loved ones. Outside her window, she could hear the sound of helicopters returning from patrol. The war in Afghanistan continued, and there would be other missions, other emergencies, and other opportunities to make a difference. But for now, she was content to know that 847 Marines were alive because she had been there when they needed her most. The Apache that had carried her into battle was being rebuilt by the maintenance crews, who were working around the clock to return Ghost Rider to operational status. The helicopter had become something of a legend on the base, and everyone wanted to be part of getting it back into the fight. As she finished her letter home, Vasquez realized that the events in the valley had changed her as well. She had always known that her job was important, but experiencing firsthand the difference she could make in the lives of fellow service members had given her a new sense of purpose and determination. The next morning, she would be back in the cockpit of another Apache, ready to provide support for Marines and soldiers who were conducting dangerous missions in enemy territory. But she would carry with her the memory of 847 Marines who had faced overwhelming odds and survived, and the knowledge that she had played a crucial role in their survival. In the years to come, the story of the ambush in the valley would become part of military legend, passed down from one generation of pilots and Marines to the next. It would serve as an example of what could be accomplished when courage, skill, and determination came together at exactly the right moment. But for Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vasquez, It would always be remembered simply as the day she did her job and brought 847 Marines home alive.